Every writer has heard the phrase, writing is rewriting, and just like a bunch of other platitudes, such as write what you know or show don't tell, it's kind of true, and it's also kind of completely fucking unhelpful.
Okay, that's not helping.
I know it's not helpful because a question I get all the time is, how do you go about rewriting your scripts? So in this video, I'm going to talk about my rewrite process, and I'm going to talk about some other things that I've seen professionals do consistently. And then at the end, I'm going to give you a rewrite checklist that you can download in case it helps with your own process. But first things first, don't expect this to be easy. In fact, if there's one thing that separates professional writers from people who will never make the leap from amateur, it's that they're generally willing to do the things that nobody else will do. And that absolutely extends to how they rewrite. The number one thing you need to be great at rewriting is an openness to throwing out material that took you weeks or even months to write, so that you can approach it from an entirely new perspective in search of the best version possible. I'll share a story with you. This was like 2012 when I was working on an early draft of Aftermath. And by the way, if you haven't seen my other videos, that is a movie that took over a decade to get made and is finally coming out at the end of this year. Back when I was first working on Aftermath, I wasn't a pro writer yet, but I had become kind of good enough that I knew a couple people, and I'd kind of stumbled into this fantasy baseball league filled with pro writers. It became this really fun way to get to know them and just kind of this cool opportunity to just get to talk every day with people who knew what they were doing. So I was chatting with one of the guys in this league, a filmmaker named Dave Diamond, who I've always had a lot of respect for, and I was talking about some of the struggles I was having in terms of figuring out this next draft. Well, one of the other guys in that league was F. Scott Fraser, and Scott had just sold a couple huge specs, and he was just this super hot writer at the time, and he's actually gone on to have a really great career. And what Dave said about him was this. He was continually impressed by Scott's ability to just throw out an entire draft and start over from a blank page one if he felt that something wasn't working. I mean, if Scott, who was definitely a better writer than I was willing to do that with his own work, shouldn't I have been open to doing that with mine? And so that's basically what I did, and it's what I've done with all but one of my scripts since then, sometimes more than once per script. I've scratched up a new outline, opened up a brand new document, and started over right from the beginning. Now that doesn't mean that I don't retain some of the same basic structure. I often do. You know, parts of set pieces and action beats and even bits of dialogue are also likely to remain. Occasionally, there are even times where I actually can copy and paste over like an entire scene from the last draft. But the point of it is this: every change you make in a screenplay has a ripple effect that spreads out through the entire script. And if a rewrite is going to have you changing enough of it, it's actually easier to start over from page one and then just kind of build it out chronologically, rather than tracking the impact of every single change over and over and over again. Tone and characters also often change from draft to draft, and by just starting over, it's easier to make those things more consistent. Most importantly, the mere act of opening a new document tells your brain that you can take this script anywhere you like. You are no longer fixed to the confines of the last draft. It allows your mind to be truly open, and that means that the new draft is almost definitely going to be more creative. Page one rewrites are scary. They are scary as hell. But remember how I said the number one thing that separates pros from amateurs is their willingness to do the things that nobody else will do? Well, this is one of them. And sure enough, as I've gotten to know a lot more professionals over the years, I've found that most of them have no problem throwing out a draft and starting over from scratch. And for me at least, almost every single time I do a page one rewrite, within like 2 or 3 pages of starting, I go from feeling daunted to invigorated because it just becomes crystal clear that I am on the path towards something that's much better. Okay, so maybe I've convinced you of the merits of a page one rewrite, or at least that like scripts often need major overhauls. But how do you even figure out what's not working or what needs to be improved? The truth is, only so much of this is going to come from your own instincts. Those will improve over time, but if you want to bring out the best in your work and the best in yourself, then you need to get objective feedback. You don't need to pay for it, and in fact, I think you're probably better off if you just get it from other writers, and I've got a whole video on how you can find them if you want to check that out, but you do need to get feedback. So the first part of my rewrite process, before I even send it out for notes, is to prep my work for those notes. Reading a script for notes takes a lot of time, and I want to respect that time by not sending something out that's riddled with errors and typos. I also don't want people wasting their time catching a mistake that I could have caught myself. So before I send a draft to anyone, I read it and I just take notes on the things that I think need to be changed. I then print it out and I do the same thing, marking up the whole thing with an orange pen because I swear I see things differently when it's printed. Once I've executed all those changes that I've zeroed in on myself, that is when I send it out to other people. Sometimes those changes are pretty significant, and so that whole process can easily take a week or two or more. But again, I want to respect my readers' time, and so I'm willing to put in that effort. And by the way, speaking of respecting their time, I always do my damnedest to get it down to a reasonable page count because I don't want to waste somebody's time with a bloated script. There aren't that many rules when it comes to screenwriting, but page count is actually one of them. Anyway, when I send it out, my goal is to get 2 or 3 sets of notes. Almost every time, somebody who says that they're happy to take a look will have something come up in their life, or they'll just forget, or whatever. I don't hold it against them. As I said, reading scripts for notes takes a lot of time. They're doing me a favor, and as far as I'm concerned, they don't owe me a thing. But I do want to hedge for that, and so what I usually do is send that script out to a couple more people than I actually need to read it. There are some pros who might only have 1 or 2 people read it, by the way, and there's a good reason for that. You have to assume when you ask somebody to read that at some point they might ask you to reciprocate. That takes time. And if I get 3 sets of notes on 4 drafts of a script, that's 12 scripts that I need to be prepared to read for others. So I do need to make sure that I'm available to do that. Anyway, once I get notes in, it's usually been like 2 or 3 weeks, which has given me a little bit of space and a little more objectivity. Notes come back in all sorts of styles. Some people only focus on like 2 or 3 major issues. Others go into so much detail that they include lines of dialogue they bumped on and typos. I appreciate all of it. I try to read through all of them in one sitting and just kind of consider them as a package, looking for common trends. Sometimes only one person has a note on something, and if I find that I don't really agree with it, I don't usually worry about it. Other times, people might have wildly different takes on how to approach something, but they're all coming from the same basic issue. That tells me that's an issue I really need to take a look at. Anything I think I need to fix, whether it's like a major issue or a typo, I drop into a new document as a bullet point with a checkbox. I like to organize these into 3 categories for major, moderate, and minor fixes. Minor fixes are things that I can fix in just a few minutes. Moderate fixes might be things that could take me all the way up to an hour, and then the major fixes are just things that are even bigger than that. I also like to color code these as red, blue, and green because it just kind of instantly lets me see how much work I have in front of me. If once I've done this, I realize that something like the tone or the structure is all wrong, or the protagonist's goal needs to change, or the characters need a major overhaul, or the concept itself needs another layer, or anything else that is going to significantly alter the shape of the script, I buckle in for a page 1 rewrite.
Buckle up, my friend. You're about to embark on a great adventure.
If those core elements are mostly working and I simply need to just draw a little bit more out of them or maybe shore up a couple plot holes, I stick with the document I have, I save a new file for the next draft, and then I just start going down that checklist, checking off those checkboxes. By the way, quick tangent here, something I learned in recent years that has been really helpful. I no longer save documents as like draft 1, draft 2, draft 3, etc. I now save them as the script name with the year and then the date. When you're doing many drafts of a script, I find that makes it way easier to keep track of them over time. I do always save old drafts though, because it's empowering to know that if I change something and it doesn't work, I can always go back to the old version. How many drafts do pro writers typically do, by the way? For the longest time, I figured 3 or 4 really solid rewrites would get me to a final draft, no problem. And to be fair, the 4th draft of Aftermath was the version that got me my first manager. But like, he had a lot of notes he wanted me to execute before he took it out. And so I did 2 rewrites for him and then 2 more rewrites when we brought other producers on. And then years later, with a whole new option and a whole new manager when Voltage Pictures came on board, I did 3 more rewrites for them. All told, I think I did like 12 drafts of Aftermath before we got that green light, and the final draft that I turned in is a whole lot different than that first one that got me my first manager. The other scripts of mine that have gotten anywhere close to getting made have also all had far more than 4 drafts. This used to make me feel a little insecure. I kind of felt like, if I'm a competent writer at all, I should be able to nail a story in a few drafts. But then I listened to a podcast with Oscar winner Michael Arndt, who wrote Little Miss Sunshine and Toy Story 3, among other things, and he said that anytime he starts a new script, he prepares himself for at least 20 drafts. So that made me feel a little bit better, and also, it's a bit freeing because it means that, you're not really looking for perfection on draft 4 necessarily, you're simply looking for better. As I go through a draft, I'm also always polishing up the rest of it, just kind of looking for places to punch up the dialogue or make a specific beat hit harder. I'm looking for ways to clean up the action lines and just make them more readable too. So hopefully, over multiple drafts, those things will become really solid just as a result of continually working on them, even if they weren't on that original checklist that I had. So that is basically my rewrite process, and I tend to repeat it until the only notes that I'm getting back are like micro notes. Essentially, people are giving me notes about these small things, like ways to beef up a moment or make a line of dialogue punchier, but I'm no longer getting big notes about things like plot or concept or character or structure or tone. Once I get to that point, I know that I'm really close to having something that's ready to be read by the industry. And at that point, I do a final polish and I typically call it done. And now that I'm a professional, hopefully my manager or my employers also agree. So specifically, what are some of those major things that you should be looking out for as you prepare for that next rewrite? Well, I've got a whole checklist for you that I think you'll find pretty helpful. But before we get into that, if you'd like to support this channel, don't contribute to my Patreon because I don't have one and I don't plan to start one. But do feel free to hit those like and subscribe buttons. That little thumbs up will make a difference in who sees this. Anyway, this checklist is obviously going to be non-exhaustive, but if you focus on these things, chances are your next draft is going to be a whole lot stronger. So let's start with concept, because that's what's going to get people to watch this thing in the first place. Does this concept have that unique special hook that is going to make people pay for a ticket or choose it over everything else that Netflix shows them? What's the trailer going to look like? Are there enough trailer moments in the script to sell the movie to an audience? Are you taking full advantage of the premise? If you're writing Jurassic Park, do you have enough cool and varied dinosaur moments? Is there enough setup for the audience to buy into the idea and suspend their disbelief? So like, again, if you're doing Jurassic Park, do you have that DNA exposition scene, and also, is it interesting? Next, let's look at your protagonist, because they are the reason why your audience will keep watching your movie. Is it clear what your protagonist wants before we get to the inciting incident so that we'll empathize with them when it happens? Do we know enough about who your protagonist is early on for them to feel like a real person? And have we seen what brings them joy? Do we have at least some sense of what their flaw is in Act 1? Is their goal throughout the movie clearly defined so that the audience knows what they're after? Are they active? Do they make a choice to pursue their goal as they move into Act 2? And do they continue making interesting and active choices throughout the rest of the movie? Do all of their actions make sense? Are there any that feel like they're forced for the sake of the plot? And finally, do we understand what they stand to gain if they succeed? And do we know what they stand to lose if they fail? Okay, next let's talk about your other characters, including your antagonist. If the antagonist is a person, is their goal and motivation clear from early enough on that we understand not only what they want, but what they're willing to do to get it? Because they're going to be the primary driver of conflict in this script, getting that right is critical. If there's a romantic interest, do we understand why the protagonist would fall in love with them outside of their general attractiveness? Related, does that love interest character have agency in the story? All too often, they don't. Does every character with a significant line or action in the script have at least something that makes them interesting? How do the secondary characters change as a result of the story? Do your antagonist and other characters take any actions that feel inauthentic to who their characters are, simply for the sake of the plot? Now let's look at your setting for a minute. Have you done enough to make that setting feel cinematic? Does the audience understand where they are from early on? Will a reader be able to easily track the geography of the setting on the page? Are there things that you can do with the setting to make it feel like more lived in and real? Are there elements of the setting that can be used to surprise and delight your audience? Once you've looked at your setting, take a closer look at tone and genre. How would you describe your tone to somebody? Put it into words and use movie comps if it's necessary. Is that tone consistent in every single scene? Does the tone still make sense for the movie? Could you make the movie even stronger by changing it up a little bit? Does the script hit the basic conventions of a genre while still managing to avoid cliches? Are there cliches from the genre that you can turn on their heads, surprising and once again delighting your audience? Finally, after all that, take a look at pacing and flow. Are any of the transitions between your scenes awkward? What can be done to improve the flow of those? Do your scenes typically begin as late as possible and end as early as possible? Does each scene end in a way that encourages the viewer to keep watching the next one? Is there enough conflict, suspense, and drama within each individual scene to keep the audience audience from finding something else to watch? We live in the age of Netflix and YouTube. It's really easy to click another button. Are there scenes that are simply there to explain things and that don't impact the story? How can those be cut, and how can that information be spliced in elsewhere? Are there any shoe leather, traveling scenes, or similar that simply show a character doing something like going from point A to point B? So those are the questions in the checklist, and simply answering those questions is a lot of work. But again, if you want to be a professional, a lot of work is what's necessary. Many of these things are going to become instinct over time, but honestly, even if you're more experienced, it's still not a bad idea to quickly run down a checklist like this, because it's very easy to miss a couple things. If you find those checklist questions useful, I actually put them all in a Google Doc that you can download, and you'll find the link in the description below the video. Try it out, use it, see where it takes you. You might find that it unlocks some new ideas about your story that get you really excited to tackle the next draft. And when you feel excited to start on a rewrite, that is always a really good sign. If you found any of this helpful, please do hit those like and subscribe buttons. They actually do kind of support the channel. And feel free to say hi or ask a question in the comments. Thanks so much, everybody, and I'll see you next time.